Imagine the first night of a brand new year. While most of the country is finishing off a glass of champagne or sleeping off a party, Jeffrey Bernhard is dragging his body through the freezing Michigan snow. It is 8:30 p.m. on January 1st, 2025. Jeffrey has been shot twice. His breath comes out in ragged, white puffs as he pushes himself across the ice, moving away from his home on Nollar Bend Road and toward the only hope he has left. Behind him, the silence in his house is heavy. It is the kind of silence that only follows absolute chaos. Just minutes ago, his front door was kicked in. The air was filled with the metallic smell of gunpowder and the screams of his family. Now, his wife is gone. His father-in-law is gone. And most terrifyingly, his 2 young daughters are missing. They did not just run away. They were taken into the dark by 3 armed intruders who seemed to know exactly what they were looking for. This was not a random robbery. This was a tactical strike on a quiet home in Northfield Township, a rural district in Washtenaw County where everyone usually feels safe. The people who broke in that night were not looking for jewelry or cash. They were there for the children. One was a 10-year-old girl, and the other was a 4-year-old foster child. As Jeffrey crawled toward his neighbor's porch, he knew that every second mattered. He was the only witness left who could tell the police that this was not just a domestic dispute. It was a kidnapping. But as the police began to piece together the identity of the lead kidnapper, Siobhan Vinson, they found something even more disturbing. Vinson was the biological mother of the 4-year-old, but she was also a career criminal with a 20-year history of violence. She claimed she was saving her daughter from a demonic family, but the truth was far more predatory. A dark secret was hidden beneath the surface of this custody battle, a plan to sell one of the children for profit. Before we dive into the dark reality of what happened on Nollar Bend Road and the system that failed to prevent it, I want to take a moment to connect with you. Where are you watching from today? What time is it there? And what is the weather like in your neck of the woods? I love reading your comments and seeing how far the crime Cortex community reaches. If you are ready to uncover the truth behind this case and follow the trail of a mother-turned-predator, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You will not want to miss a single detail of how this story unfolded or the shocking revelation that changed everything for the survivors. This is a story about faith, failure, and a father's refusal to die. It is a story about how 3 people managed to invade a home and leave a trail of blood on a night that was supposed to be about new beginnings. We are going to look at the criminal records, the bizarre religious delusions, and the human trafficking plot that almost succeeded. This is the investigation of the Washtenaw County Foster Killings. To understand the weight of the tragedy that hit Nollar Bend Road, you have to understand the people who live there. Northfield Township is not the kind of place that makes the national news. It is a quiet patch of Washtenaw County, Michigan, where the roads are long and the neighbors tend to look out for one another. In this scenic, rural district, the Bernhard family was seen as the gold standard of what a family should be. They were not just residents, they were pillars of the community. Jeffrey Bernhard was 48 years old. She was a woman who had dedicated her life to her faith and her family. Before she became a full-time mother, she was an ordained minister with the Assemblies of God. Her father, Stevie Ray Smith, lived with them. He was 74 years old and was an ordained pastor who had spent decades sharing a message of peace and hope. This was a house built on the foundation of the church. They did not just talk about their beliefs, they lived them out in a way that everyone around them could see. The Bernhards' home was a place of constant activity and care. They were currently fostering 2 young girls, a 10-year-old and a 4-year-old. The younger girl was the biological daughter of a woman named Siobhan Vinson, but to the Bernhards, she was simply their daughter. Neighbors later shared that the couple was not just fostering the little girl. They were in the middle of a process they hoped would end in a permanent adoption. They wanted to give her a forever home, a place where she could grow up surrounded by the same love they gave their older daughter. Jeffrey Bernhard later sat on a witness stand and gave a heart-wrenching account of what their daily life looked like before the violence broke out. Every Sunday morning, without fail, the family was at church. Every Wednesday night, they were back again for midweek services. The girls were deeply involved in the kids' church and Sunday school, but it was the quiet, private moments that showed the true character of Jennifer and Stevie. Every single night, the family had a ritual. They would sit down together and read the Bible. They would go through 1 or 2 storybooks with each girl, making sure they felt heard and loved. And as they tucked the 4-year-old into bed, Jennifer would sing Christian songs to her to help her fall asleep. This was the environment those children were being raised in, one of scripture, song, and security. But while the Bernhards were focusing on building a life of peace, a storm was brewing on the horizon. Siobhan Vinson was not just a grieving mother who wanted her child back. She was a woman with a rap sheet that stretched back 20 years. We are talking about a history of crime that included everything from theft and drugs to bomb threats and assaulting police officers. Vinson had been a shadow over the family for a long time. There had been threats made previously related to the foster daughter, and the Bernhards were aware of the danger. The most unsettling part of this entire story is the irony of Vinson's motive. On the night of the attack, while she was screaming at Jennifer and Jeffrey, she did not accuse them of being bad parents in the traditional sense. Instead, she yelled that they were not letting her daughter believe in God. She called this family of ordained ministers and pastors evil and demonic. It is a bizarre, bone-deep contradiction. A woman with a violent criminal history was claiming that a family of ministers was the one standing in the way of a child's spiritual life. Jeffrey testified that even as the situation escalated, he and Jennifer tried to stay calm. They tried to answer Vinson's questions. They tried to de-escalate the tension because that was their nature. But their calmness only seemed to make Vinson more aggressive. In her eyes, their faith was a weapon, and she was there to take it back. The details of this family's life make the eventual outcome feel even more senseless. They were people of peace who were met with a level of violence that is hard to wrap your head around. It makes you wonder how the system could allow someone like Vinson, with her extensive history of threats and assaults, to get close enough to pull off such a coordinated strike. The details of the legal battle and the search for the suspects only get more intense from here. If this story is gripping you, make sure to like the video. It helps us keep sharing these important stories with the world and ensures that the victims are never forgotten. Where we go next is into the heart of the manhunt and the shocking discovery that proved this was never just about a mother's love. It was about something much darker. The sun had long since set on January 1st, 2025. In Northfield Township, the beginning of the year usually feels like a deep breath, a time to stay inside, keep the heater running, and enjoy the quiet of the winter. But at 8:30 p.m., that quiet was shattered. A car pulled up near the Bernhard residence on Nollar Bend Road, carrying 3 people whose intentions were far from celebratory. Siobhan Vinson, Gregory Colhun, and Keith Finley were not there for a late New Year's visit. They were there to execute a plan that had been simmering for weeks. As they approached the house, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Jeffrey Bernhard later testified that he was immediately on high alert. He didn't just see random strangers. He saw 2 males and 1 female. Before he even saw Siobhan Vinson's face clearly, a wave of recognition hit him. He knew exactly who was at his door because of the threats that had been made previously. The air in the room, once filled with the warmth of a family evening, suddenly turned heavy with the metallic weight of impending violence. The suspects did not wait for an invitation. They forced their way inside, and the confrontation began almost immediately. It was not a conversation. It was a chaotic, high-volume assault of words and accusations. Vincent was the one leading the charge, her voice cutting through the house. She wasn't asking for her daughter back with a mother's plea. She was demanding justice for a perceived spiritual crime. She screamed at Jennifer and Jeffrey, her face contorted with a rage that seemed to transcend a simple custody dispute. This is where she hurled those accusations that still haunt the survivors, calling the ministers evil and demonic. Jeffrey and Jennifer were in an impossible position. As people of faith, their first instinct was to de-escalate. Jeffrey testified that they remained calm. They tried to answer her questions. They tried to speak to her as human beings, hoping that a rational response would lower the temperature in the room. But in a mind fueled by the kind of delusion Vincent was experiencing, calmness is often seen as a challenge. Every soft word from the Bernhards seemed to act like gasoline on a fire. The more they tried to act as ministers of peace, the more Vincent's aggression spiked. Then came the sound that no one ever forgets. The mechanical, unforgiving crack of a firearm. In the span of just a few seconds, the house on Nollar Bend Road became a crime scene. Jennifer Bernhard, 48, was shot. Her father, Stevie Ray Smith, the 74-year-old pastor who had spent his life praying for others, was also targeted. The violence was swift and absolute. Jeffrey Bernhard, 53, was shot twice. He described the moment as a blur of motion and pain, a sensory overload where the world suddenly narrowed down to the survival of his children. As Jeffrey lay on the floor, the suspects didn't stop to check on the victims. Their focus shifted to the children. They grabbed the 10-year-old girl and the 4-year-old foster daughter, pulling them from the only home they had ever known to be safe. The girls were forced out into the cold and into a waiting vehicle. In the minds of the children, this was likely a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. They were being taken by the very woman their parents had warned them about, leaving behind a house that was now silent for all the wrong reasons. But the suspects made one critical mistake. They left Jeffrey Bernhard alive. After the intruders fled into the night, Jeffrey regained consciousness. He was bleeding from 2 gunshot wounds, and his body was screaming at him to stay down. But he knew his wife was gone. He knew his father-in-law was gone. He also knew that if he didn't move right then, no one would know that his daughters were in danger. In a display of pure, adrenaline-fueled will, Jeffrey began to crawl. He pushed himself across the floor, through the door, and out into the Michigan snow. Every inch was a battle against the cold and the blood loss. He managed to reach a neighbor's house, pounding on the door with the last of his strength to trigger the emergency response. The first responders who arrived on Nollar Bend Road found a scene that looked like a war zone. The house was a maze of forensic evidence. Investigators eventually recovered 3 spent 9mm shell casings inside the home. These small pieces of brass would eventually become the key to linking the suspects to the murders. There were no weapons left behind, and the lack of a firearm at the scene proved to the police that this was a targeted hit-and-run kidnapping, not a domestic murder-suicide. The details only get more intense from here. If this story is gripping you, make sure to like the video. It helps us keep sharing these important stories with the world and ensures that the victims are never forgotten. As the ambulances arrived for Jeffrey, a massive manhunt was already being organized. The police were not just looking for a biological mother on the run. They were looking for a trio of armed and dangerous individuals who had just executed 2 people in cold blood. The clock was ticking. Every hour the girls were with Vincent, Finley, and Callahan was another hour, where the kidnapping could turn into something even more permanent. The investigation was about to take a sharp turn. The police were beginning to look at the suspect's phone records and surveillance footage from the surrounding district. They were tracking a path, that led away from the quiet woods of Northfield Township and toward a much darker destination. They were about to find out that Siobhan Vinson wasn't just acting alone. She had recruited 2 career criminals to help her, and their motive was about to be revealed as something much more sinister than anyone first imagined. What they found in the days following the massacre would change the way the public looked at the foster care system forever. It wasn't just about a mother's love or a religious delusion. It was a business transaction. While Jeffrey Bernhard was fighting for his life on his neighbor's doorstep, the clock was already ticking for the 2 children. In a case like this, the first few hours are everything. The Northfield Township Police, along with the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office, didn't just see a domestic tragedy. They saw an active kidnapping of a 10-year-old and a 4-year-old. Every squad car in the district was on high alert, and an Amber Alert was being prepared to broadcast the details of the suspects and their vehicle to every cell phone in the state of Michigan. The investigation moved with a speed that only happens when children are on the line. Police began by looking at the recent history of the Bernhard family. It did not take long for the name Siobhan Vinson to bubble to the surface. The threats she had made in the past were well documented. She had a fixated, obsessive resentment toward the foster system and the Bernhards in particular. But as detectives started pulling her file, the scope of the danger became clear. They weren't looking for a desperate mother. They were looking for a woman with a 20-year history of criminal volatility. Using cell tower pings and traffic camera data, investigators began to trace the path of the getaway vehicle. The suspects weren't heading for a hideout in the woods or a remote cabin. They were heading toward a familiar territory, the neighborhood near the home of Vinson's mother. It was a tactical error on their part, a return to a known location that allowed the multi-jurisdictional task force to close the net. When the police finally located the vehicle and surrounded the house where the suspects were hiding, the tension was through the roof. This was a tactical takedown. The officers knew they were dealing with at least 3 individuals who had already proven they were willing to pull the trigger. They also knew the 2 girls were inside. The arrest was anything but peaceful. Siobhan Vinson did not go quietly. According to police reports, even after she was cornered and in custody, her aggression did not waver. She reportedly spit on one of the officers and was actively trying to reach for a weapon that was concealed on her person. Her behavior was erratic and violent, consistent with the reports of her previous clashes with law enforcement. Keith Finley and Gregory Callahan were also taken into custody without further bloodshed, and most importantly, the 2 girls were found. They were physically unharmed, but the emotional state of a 10-year-old and a 4-year-old who have just witnessed their parents being shot is something that is hard to put into words. They were recovered from an environment that stood in stark contrast to the quiet, faith-filled home they had been taken from just hours before. But as the suspects were brought into separate interrogation rooms, the story began to shift. Up until this point, every headline and every police brief had categorized this as a custody-related shooting. The public assumed this was a mother who had lost her mind and decided to take her child back by any means necessary. But as the detectives began to press Gregory Callahan, the narrative took a sharp, sickening turn. Callahan allegedly dropped a bombshell that changed the entire nature of the investigation. He told the police that the trio's plan was never just about getting the 4-year-old back to Vinson. He claimed that the group had a much more profitable goal in mind. They allegedly planned to sell the 10-year-old daughter, the Bernhard's biological child, for money. This was the sinister twist that no one saw coming. It wasn't just a mother's religious delusion or a battle over foster rights. It was a human trafficking plot. The suspects were allegedly using the cover of a custody dispute to facilitate a kidnapping for profit. They had invaded a home, killed 2 people, and nearly killed a 3rd, all to secure a payday. The reveal of this trafficking element sent shockwaves through Washtenaw County. It meant that the 10-year-old was not just a witness or a secondary victim. She was a target of a criminal enterprise. It also painted a much darker picture of Gregory Colhan and Keith Finley. These were not just friends helping a mother in distress. They were predatory actors who saw a child as a commodity. We are looking at a massive failure in the system here. Siobhan Vinson had a 20-year history of crime, including bomb threats and assaults on police. She had openly threatened this family before. Do you think the authorities did enough to protect the Bernhards? Or do you think the system is so overwhelmed that people like Vinson are able to slip through the cracks until it is too late? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I really want to hear your perspective on how we can better safeguard foster families from these kinds of known threats. This revelation transformed the legal landscape of the case. Suddenly, the charges weren't just about murder and home invasion. They were about conspiracy and child enticement. The custody battle was a mask. The religious accusations were a distraction. At the core of this horrific night was a calculated plan to exploit a child for cash. As the girls were placed into protective care and Jeffrey Bernhard began his long recovery in the hospital, the community was left to grapple with the reality that such a predatory plot could happen in their own backyard. The investigation was no longer just about the blood on the floor of the house on Nollar Bend Road. It was about uncovering the full extent of this trafficking ring and ensuring that no one else was on the suspect's list. The evidence was piling up. From the 9mm casings found at the scene to the testimony of Gregory Colhan, the prosecution was building an airtight case. But as we will see in the next part of this story, Siobhan Vinson was not done fighting. Her behavior in the courtroom would soon become as infamous as the crime itself, turning the legal proceedings into a spectacle that the victim's family would be forced to endure for over a year. We are going to deep dive into Vinson's criminal history next. We need to look at how she went from a small-time thief to the lead suspect in a double homicide and a trafficking plot. This is the profile of a woman who spent 2 decades testing the limits of the law until she finally broke it beyond repair. When the news first broke about the shooting in Northfield Township, the narrative in the local coffee shops and on social media was focused on a mother's desperation. People wanted to believe that this was a case of a woman pushed to the edge by a cold foster care system, a mother trying to reclaim her flesh and blood. But as the detectives in Washtenaw County started digging into the life of Siobhan Vinson, that sympathetic image vanished. What they found instead was a rap sheet that read like a manual on how to terrorize a community. Siobhan Vinson did not just have a history with the law, she had a career. We are looking at a roughly 20-year history of crime that spanned across multiple states, primarily Michigan and Virginia. This was not a woman who made a one-time mistake. This was a woman whose entire adult life was defined by volatility and a complete lack of respect for authority. Let's break down the red flags that the system seemingly ignored for 2 decades. Her records show a consistent pattern of theft and drug-related offenses, which are often the baseline for career criminals. But it is the violent escalation that stands out. Vinson had multiple charges for assaulting and obstructing police officers. In one instance, she didn't just target the police, she went after firefighters as they were trying to do their jobs. Then, there were the bomb threats. Imagine the level of calculated malice required to call in a threat designed to cause mass panic. Vinson had been through the court system for this before, yet she was back on the streets. Perhaps most disturbing were the reports of crimes she allegedly committed while she was pregnant. This was a woman who didn't even slow down for the sake of her own unborn children. By the time she targeted the Bernhard family, Vinson had accumulated over a dozen felonies. She was a prohibited person, meaning she was legally barred from even being in the same room as a firearm, let alone owning one. Yet, on New Year's night, she was armed and leading a tactical home invasion. But Vinson didn't act alone. She was the architect, but she needed muscle. That is where Gregory Callahan and Keith Finley come in. Callahan, 37, and Finley, 60, were not just random friends. They were men with their own significant criminal backgrounds who were willing to join a mission that involved shooting a 74-year-old pastor. Keith Finley is a particularly interesting figure in this crew. While Vincent has spent her time in court screaming and making a scene, Finley has done the opposite. During the preliminary hearings, he was seen trying to hide his face from the media cameras, a stark contrast to the woman he followed into that house. Gregory Callahan, on the other hand, became the weak link in their conspiracy. He was the one who eventually told police that their goal was much darker than a simple rescue. He admitted that the trio planned to sell the Bernhards' 10-year-old biological daughter for cash. This trafficking element is the key to understanding who Siobhan Vincent really is. A mother who truly loves her child and believes they are in a demonic environment might try to take them back. But a woman who plans to sell a different child for profit is not a mother in distress, she is a predator. She was using her own daughter as a pretext to get inside that house and secure a product she could flip for money. Since her arrest, Vincent's behavior has only reinforced the unhinged profile detectives built. In the Washtenaw County courtroom, she has been a one-woman wrecking crew of the legal process. She has interrupted judges, screamed over the testimony of her victims, and made such a spectacle that she has been repeatedly removed from the courtroom. Even when the hearings moved to Zoom, she couldn't help herself. She was eventually disconnected after a series of outbursts where she cursed at the judge and the prosecutors. In one hearing, she even went as far as putting her fingers in her ears like a child, while evidence of her crimes was being played for the court. This is the woman the Bernhard family was forced to deal with. This is the woman who looked at a house full of Bibles and singing children and saw an evil target. As we look at her 20-year trail of destruction, it becomes clear that the massacre on Nollar Bend Road was not an isolated incident. It was the final, inevitable conclusion of a life spent ignoring every warning the law tried to give her. We are looking at a massive failure in the system here. Do you think the authorities did enough to protect this family? Or do you think the system is so overwhelmed that people like Vincent are able to slip through the cracks until it is too late? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I really want to hear your perspective on how we can better safeguard foster families from these kinds of known threats. In the next section, we are going to look at the courtroom drama that followed the arrest. We are going to hear from Jeffrey Bernhard himself, a man who had to sit just a few feet away from the woman who killed his wife while she mocked the very legal system that was supposed to bring him justice. This is the trial of the 21st century in Washtenaw County, and the tension inside that room was high enough to snap. By the time the case reached the 14th, a district court in Washtenaw County, the atmosphere was already reaching a boiling point. It was August 5th, 2025, a day that should have been about the orderly pursuit of justice. Instead, it became a showcase for the very same erratic behavior that had defined Siobhan Vincent's life for 2 decades. Judge Cedric Simpson, a man known for his patience and control in the courtroom, was about to be tested in a way few judges ever are. The primary objective of this preliminary examination was to determine if there was enough evidence to bind the 3 suspects over for a full trial. For the prosecution, the case was straightforward. They had the DNA, they had the shell casings, and they had the survivor. But for the defense, the strategy was less about the facts and more about the atmosphere. They wanted to paint Vincent not as a calculated killer, but as a mother who had experienced a total psychological break. The heart of the day was the testimony of Jeffrey Bernhard. This was the first time the public really got to hear from the man who had survived the impossible. Jeffrey walked into the courtroom with the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was there to speak for his wife, Jennifer, and his father-in-law, Stevie. He was there to reclaim the narrative from the woman who had tried to label his family as evil. Jeffrey's testimony was a masterclass in quiet dignity. He described the night of the attack with a level of detail that made the room go silent. He talked about the sounds of the break-in and the instant he recognized the face of the woman at his door. But it was when he started talking about their life at home that the emotional gravity of the case really hit. He spoke about the ritual of the Bible readings. He described how Jennifer would sit on the edge of the bed and sing Christian songs to the 4-year-old, her voice acting as an anchor for the child in a world that had been anything but stable. The prosecution asked Jeffrey if the accusations Vincent made that they were evil and demonic were true. Jeffrey's response was simple and devastating. Absolutely not. He pointed out the deep irony that Vincent was attacking the very faith that defined their lives. While she was claiming they were spiritually suppressing the child, they were actually the ones teaching her about love, grace, and hope. It was a clash of two very different versions of righteousness, one based on service and the other on a violent, self-serving delusion. But as Jeffrey spoke, the person sitting at the defense table was not listening with remorse. Siobhan Vincent was a one-woman wrecking crew throughout the entire hearing. She did not sit quietly while the evidence was presented. She began interrupting the judge, screaming over the testimony and cursing at the prosecutors. At one point, when the evidence became particularly damning, Vincent reportedly put her fingers in her ears like a child, refusing to hear the reality of what she had done. It was a bizarre, unsettling display that forced Judge Simpson to eventually have her escorted out of the room. This was a pattern that had already started during her arraignment. Vincent had been so disruptive on the Zoom call that the court had to disconnect her entirely. Whether it was in person or on a screen, she was determined to make the process as difficult as possible for everyone involved. This behavior did not just impact the timeline of the trial. It acted as a constant, re-victimizing force for Jeffrey Bernhard and the rest of the family. They were trying to grieve, yet they were being forced to endure a circus. In contrast to Vincent's outbursts, the other two suspects, Keith Finley and Gregory Colhan, remained largely silent. Finley, the 60-year-old who had followed Vincent into the house, spent his time trying to hide from the media. He wouldn't look at the cameras, a clear sign that he understood the gravity of the human trafficking label that was now attached to his name. Colhan, who had already given up the plot to sell the 10-year-old for money, sat like a man who knew the exit doors were already locked behind him. The legal complexity of the case grew even deeper on December 17, 2025. During a major motion hearing, the defense attorneys for all three suspects made a significant move. They requested separate trials. Their argument was that the evidence against one suspect would unfairly prejudice the jury against the others. Specifically, they were worried about Gregory Colhan's statements to the police. If one jury heard that the group planned to sell a child for profit, it would be nearly impossible for that jury to look at Finley or Vincent with anything other than total condemnation. This move to sever the trials is a common tactical play in high-stakes criminal cases, but in this instance, it felt like another delay in a case that had already seen too many. The victim's family wants a unified front of justice. They want the world to see how these three people work together to dismantle a home. Separate trials would mean Jeffrey Bernhard would have to testify 3 different times, reliving the night his wife died over and over again on the witness stand. As we moved into January 2026, the focus shifted to the upcoming hearings scheduled for later this month. These proceedings are expected to address the constitutionality of the death penalty for Vincent and the final scheduling of the trials. The community is waiting to see if the system will finally hold these individuals accountable, or if the courtroom chaos will continue to stall the process. This investigation has revealed a deep, systemic failure. We have a woman with a 20-year history of violence who was able to walk into a foster home and commit a massacre. We have a human trafficking plot that was masked as a custody dispute, and we have a legal process that is being held hostage by the very person who triggered the tragedy. The story of Nollar Bend Road is a reminder that some crimes are so predatory that they leave a mark on an entire district. As we wait for the final verdicts, the focus remains on the survivors, the two girls who were taken into the night, and the father who refused to let the story end in the snow. The house on Nollar Bend Road no longer looks like a crime scene, but for the people of Northfield Township, the weight of what happened there on New Year's night remains heavy. In a small district where neighbors know each other by name, the idea that such a calculated strike could occur in their own backyard has fundamentally changed the sense of security. The rural roads of Washtenaw County, once seen as a sanctuary from the chaos of the city, are now a reminder of how easily a determined predator can breach the walls of a peaceful home. As we stand here in January 2026, the legal journey is far from over. Siobhan Vinson, Gregory Callahan, and Keith Finley remain behind bars, awaiting the start of their trials. The recent hearings on January 8th have shown that the defense is still pushing for every possible advantage, from challenging the search warrants to arguing over the admissibility of Gregory Callahan's statements about the trafficking plot. But for the prosecution, the goal remains the same: a conviction for first-degree murder that ensures these three never have the opportunity to harm another family. The legacy of this case is defined by a series of painful questions about the system that was supposed to protect the Bernhard family. We have to look at the 20-year history of Siobhan Vinson and ask why the red flags were not seen as a wall. How does a woman with a record of bomb threats and assaults on law enforcement maintain enough proximity to a foster home to plan a tactical invasion? The Washtenaw County Foster Killings have sparked a statewide conversation about the vetting process for biological parents and the need for better security protocols for foster caregivers who are doing the difficult work of the state. But the true legacy of Nollar Bend Road is not found in the court records or the criminal profiles. It is found in the resilience of Jeffrey Bernhard. After dragging himself through the snow and fighting for his life in a hospital bed, Jeffrey has become a voice for the family he lost. He has remained dedicated to the two girls who were taken that night, ensuring they have the support and therapy they need to process a trauma that no child should ever witness. His story is a testament to a father's refusal to let a predator have the last word. Jennifer Bernhard and Stevie Ray Smith are remembered not for the way they died, but for the way they lived. They were people of service who spent their final moments trying to protect the children they loved. Their ministry of care, based on faith and the nightly ritual of singing songs and reading the Bible, remains the light that offsets the darkness of Siobhan Vinson's delusions. As the trials begin later this year, the Crime Cortex community will be watching. We will be looking for the moment when justice is finally served for the two ministers and the pastor who gave everything for their community. This case is a stark reminder that while evil can breach a door, it cannot erase the impact of a life lived for others. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into case. This investigation has been one of the most complex and unsettling stories we have ever covered on this channel. If you found this narrative compelling and think more people need to hear about the systemic failures that led to this tragedy, please share this video. It is the best way to help us grow the Crime Cortex community and keep these important stories in the public eye. Don't forget to check the links in the description for ways you can support the survivors and stay updated on the upcoming trial dates. I'll see you in the next investigation.